So welcome everyone to the Food for Thought speaker series at the Picker Center. We're glad to have all of you join us today for our wonderful guest, Paul Lindbergh, who's an EMPA alum, and who's the Assistant Director of CAA Global and Diversity Engagement, who will be discussing achieving equitable tourism successes in New York City, a strategic policy memo for the incoming 110th Mayor of New York City. Just a quick note before I hand it over to Bill to do the intro. If you have any questions, please keep them to the end. Please keep yourself on mute and check out the website for future events. And you could put questions in the chat too. And we'll get to that in the Q&A section of the session. So thank you everyone for joining, and now I'll hand it off to Bill.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you all. And in particular, Jeremy and Valerie, for keeping this series alive and well throughout and now past, well, almost past the pandemic. You know, if you haven't checked out the website, please do, because all of our discussions are archived there, and they're really fascinating and great. And today is just another great addition. Paul is just one of the really good people that I've met in my life. You know, some people, you get a vibe that they're neutral, you know, whatever, but he just broadcasts goodness, which is really special. And I liked him from the beginning. And in fact, it's sort of like my test of how good a person is if Steve Cohen and or my wife agree with me, then it's 100%, because neither one of them ever agrees with me on anything. And we all agree that Paul is just like a really great person. So he is. And on top of being a great person, he's a very astute observer of the economy, and in particular, how tourism and travel play into economies of big cities, and particularly ours here in New York. And he and I had the opportunity to do several courses together, and I think we together learned a lot. And I think his talk today is particularly important, because in just a few weeks, we're going to have the Democratic primary for mayor, which ostensibly elects the next mayor. And the mayor candidates, rightly so, have been talking a lot about what happens next. And I'm not so sure many of them, I'm almost tempted to say any of them, have a real idea of what they're going to do to get the economy back to where it was. And they better get a clue quick. And Paul's research on this is, I think, really important, because one, it focuses on the importance of tourism. And secondly, it sets out a way that we could make the benefits of tourism better for all of New York. Because one of the aspects of it is tourism is a huge business for us. It's really important, but it almost tends to be over-concentrated in some places. So the quality and impact of the tourism is diminished, I think, certainly in terms of the quality of the experience, but also even in the economic impact, right? If you have to wait 3 hours to get to the top of the Empire State Building, a lot of times you're just going to walk away. So if we could better manage all our tourists by getting them around the city, it would have much more of an impact on the whole city and small business and everything else. So his research is incredibly important, and hopefully this series will help get his ideas around and maybe even get them into the successful candidate for mayor, and somebody will implement what he's found and is recommending. So Paul, thank you so much for all the work you've done, not just on this paper, but for us. He's been on the executive council here at the EMPA program and done a lot for Columbia University in general, in terms of alumni affairs. So Paul, please take it away, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Emick. It really is an honor, and you're really too generous. And I also want to thank Jeremy and Valerie. I know you do a lot of work for the larger EMPA program. I really appreciate it. I got the opportunity to work with a lot of you on the Executive Council, the SEPA Alumni Association, the SEPA Student Association, and it was a real pleasure to work with you. And it's a great opportunity to speak here. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see if this works. Can everyone see my screen?
Thumbs up.
So we have just a few questions. So just want to try to read the room. Who's joining us here today? If you'd like to just add in where you're joining from, and also, what city, where you're joining. Could be the neighborhood in New York, it could be the city, it could be the country. I can see some friends that are joining from different places all around the world. So thank you everyone for joining, and also fellow classmates. And then because Memorial Day weekend is upon us, I wanted to find out if anyone has any travel destination plans, which kind of connects with what we're doing, talking about tourism here. So it would be great to see that. So I'll just read out some of the things people are saying here. We have someone from Albania, wonderful, Shiptare. And then we have someone in the Bronx, a lot of Albanians in the Bronx too. Manhattan, 119th Street, Brooklyn, Queens, Paris, Miami, Florida, Turkey, Paris. I believe that's going to Vermont in June. Maybe I'm reading these wrong. Sorry, someone's going to Turkey. Someone from Philadelphia, going to Philadelphia, Washington Heights, and different people around Manhattan. So we've got a really wonderful group of diverse people joining today. So I really appreciate many of you who either know directly or connected with, but I just want to start, frame where we're at right now. Professor Emick talked briefly about me graduating. I graduated only a few weeks ago, really proud to be a graduate. And I see some fellow classmates who are graduating now, and also the 2020 grads. Congratulations to everybody. Really happy to be part of the EMPA, SEPA, larger kind of alumni, Columbia, larger community. Just a little bit more about me. I work as the Assistant Director of Global and Diversity Engagement at the Columbia Alumni Association. So we work with over 100 different alumni clubs and associations and shared interest groups around the world. I work with alumni in Europe, Africa, Washington, D.C., Boston, Chicago. So I'm always working with Columbia alumni, and I finally am an alumni, so it is even more powerful now. We have over 700 events annually, and it's a really great job to work with that. We really try to create volunteer-driven programming with the alumni, and it is a real sustainable and equitable program that we try to work on that. So it kind of does dovetail well with my tourism talk today. For example, of types of programming we do, the Columbia Professor Fireside Chat with the two co-founders of the New Climate School at Columbia in Washington, D.C., a virtual talk, or a wine tasting in Italy. I probably would choose the wine tasting in Italy, but both of them are fantastic events. But just talk about what I was doing before I got to Columbia, because I've worked at Columbia for 5 years now. I worked in the tourism industry for almost a decade with an organization called Hosteling International, which is a youth travel organization which welcomes over 250,000 visitors to New York City every year, organizing different types of cultural and educational programs with about 20,000 participants on an annual basis, and really learned about the intricacies of the New York City tourism industry, and the pluses and minuses of working within that. I think there's a lot of benefits. We have a lot of domestic travelers, people coming from different parts of the United States to New York, and also international travelers from China, Brazil, similar to the international students that are at Columbia as well. So I have a real passion for tourism and travel on a personal and professional level. And I think the different classes that I've taken at the EMPA program, the Public Management Innovation with Professor Emick, Cities in a Globalized World, Transforming the Urban Economy with Professor Walsh, Social Enterprise and Community Economic Development, comparative social welfare and political economy seminar with Professor Yamiche Mbukuro. Took a lot of wonderful classes learning about public policy and how it really connects. And it really led me to take a look at the tourism industry that I was working with in New York City and how can we make it better? How can we take a look? And this is an executive program. So the executive program really goes to the C-suite. And who's the C-suite of New York City? That is the mayor. And we're at a really inflection point right in New York City right now. Going to my next slide. The inflection point for New York City is we have a new mayor. We're also have the Biden-Harris administration as a new administration in Washington. This is a real opportunity to change many different policies and move forward. And the reason I framed my memo the way I did to the mayor was New York City can truly be a leader to develop a new initiatives around tourism. People come to New York. We're the largest tourism destination in New York City. Almost 70 million travelers were coming to New York City on an average basis. And we were doing that year over year. And it's a huge part of the economy. And I'll talk more about that as I go. But how can we take that number? It's maintaining that number, but how does that equitably get distributed across all of New York City, and how can it be sustainable over the long term? Mayor de Blasio just announced recently, after I finished my paper with Professor Emick, but a $25 million being spent with the NYC and Company, which is primarily focused on marketing. But again, with my recommendations, which I'll go through later, it's not just about marketing. It's not just about getting more people to be coming here. It's really about looking at things from a different perspective, in a different lens. And I think those are some of the things that I learned from the EMPA program, and I'll go through it with you now. So let me go to the next slide here. So we're going to be going over basically the general topic of my memo, and then what are different details or ways we can go through the issue, looking at some metrics, and then analyzing the research, and then some really lessons or next steps that the mayor can put in place when they come into office in 2022. I will not say, let's go to the next slide. I will not say, I am agnostic in the political belief here. Any one of these people could be very successful as a mayor. I don't think it's a very easy job to be doing for anybody. Coming as the New York City, it's one of the hardest jobs in the world. If everyone would like to mute, I think we hear someone in the background, just letting everyone know. So for the mayor election that Professor Emick alluded to, there'll also be ranked choice voting, which is coming up. So it'll be very interesting to see how that kind of unstraps with maybe new candidates and a new mayor. So let's just go back to the past as prologue. The cruise industry in the post 9/11 world really had a similar thing, which is happening now with COVID. In September 11, 2001, when everything was shut down with flights across the country, the cruise industry was primarily focused in Florida. You would fly down there and go to the Caribbean. And after September 11th, things really did change. They really diversified across the entire country. There was an increase in the amount of ports, New York City, one of the ports, but also on the West Coast, throughout the Eastern Seaboard in Canada. And people within the United States were able to drive within 300 to 400 miles to a port to take a cruise. And the cruise industry did a large pivot to make people who didn't want to get on a flight and travel within the US. And I think that inflection point that we were in 2001, in 2021, 20 years later, we're going into the same point. And how can we really maximize that? The cruise industry is the example of, that luxury or one of the great things, but how can we look at that? I'm not going to talk specifically about the cruise industry here, but I'm just using that as an example of how they kind of pivoted after. One of the things I found in my research was the donut economic theory. And if you haven't checked it out, Kate Raworth from Oxford University has a donut economic theory. I love donuts. But on top of them being a great food, if you look at the hole in the middle and sort of the outside, the idea is in the center, if people have less than they can survive, not enough food, not enough resources for housing and different things, they're not living their optimum life. But if they have within the donut enough, but not too much, it's a happy medium. But if they go beyond that, you are kind of living in excess. And I think, as we all know, being familiar with New York City, we are definitely in a point where there's a lot of people living in the excess and a lot of people who are living in difficult times, particularly during the COVID period. How can we really shoot towards the donut economic theory? I know we all have the micro or the macro but I think donut economic theory is an interesting idea because cities like Amsterdam, Philadelphia, and Portland are looking at different ways on how to implement, looking at their larger economy, not just tourism, but different ways that they can try to affect. One thing in Amsterdam that they're doing is to try to find ways to provide housing. So similar to what's happening in New York City with Airbnb and different companies that are increasing the rent for different places because tourists are coming into the area. Amsterdam is trying to find affordable ways to offer housing to people. And it's really trying to address within that donut economic theory to really provide that sort of sweet spot in the middle. Another thing, this is not to do with tourism, but another thing they're doing in Amsterdam is with the jeans. They're making jeans is another industry in Amsterdam. And they actually are trying to use less water to create jeans, or to make jeans. It uses a lot of water because of the dyes, and they're trying to lessen the amount of water. So I think using different economic theories, such as the donut economic theory, as approach for the new mayor is going to be a key. And that's more of a holistic approach, but I'm happy to share more about that later as we go through. Next. So what has happened in the last 2 decades? There has been a huge boom in travel, especially with the ultra low flights. There have been 1.9 billion passengers in 2004 to 4.5 billion passengers at the end of 2019. And they were expecting to go even farther, close to 7 billion or 8 billion passengers. But as we kind of move into this new direction, how do we focus when people have a certain amount of income? I attended a talk with one of the high-level airline experts, and he was saying that as people increase their wages above $3,000 or $4,000 yearly, people are flying more. And we should expect people from India, people from China, people from different parts of people in Africa as well, to be flying more. And as these flights increase, we need to really look at how is that going to be sustainable and equitable over the long term. I have another example later, which I'm going to be focusing more around local tourism or microtourism. But again, understanding the metrics and the numbers. So people often focus in New York City around the economic drivers of the finance industry or healthcare or the tech industry, but over 400,000 jobs come from travel and tourism. And during COVID, 300,000 of those jobs were lost. It was the most devastated industry. And the people that work within that industry are primarily women, and then also people with less than a bachelor's degree in education. So we're talking about a community that really is obviously benefiting from the boom in the tourism industry, but how can we really create those better paying jobs within tourism? Obviously, employers, large hotels are doing very well, but the real idea around having more small businesses or moderate sized businesses to be incorporated, and the mayor has the impact on that. So I looked at a few different kind of key elements that would make a successful city. The needs of the New York City people the climate impact that tourism has, and then having just a performing economy. Again, we looked at a few different things. The city in Venice has actually looked at a tourism tax, which they still haven't implemented yet, but they're looking at charging 5 to 10 euros for each day tripper who's visiting Venice. Now, I don't think New York City at this point needs the 5 to 10 euro expense, but I think when you look at different locations around New York where there's a critical mass, maybe around Brooklyn Bridge or Brooklyn Bridge Park, they have the Hudson Yards, different areas. There are different critical mass areas where we can try to figure out to create timed entry around areas to really push people to go to different areas around New York. I know they were still pushing, more people are not really going back to Times Square as quickly, but they will come back. Looking at some of the other tourism sort of grading systems, I know that the restaurants of New York have a grading system, which is that letter grading system. Trying to create a new grading system for the tourism companies of New York. So if you're someone coming from another country or just domestically, you can see the actual equitable or sustainable impact of that company. The New York has created with the buildings department, the GOB, they actually have a grading system for buildings who have electric clean efficiency, and they get a letter grade only once a year, and they have an opportunity to update things. I think giving the tourism industry a similar letter grade, maybe on an annual basis, on a quarterly basis, to really have them be hiring people locally, that's a key thing, giving people sustainable wages, but also really what their climate impact is as well. We have a lot of industries or the boom that sort of opens up, but if we are not transparent for people, you won't see that. One other thing I want to highlight for you, this photo that you might be seeing on your screen here is very interesting. I'll talk about it a little bit, but the photo on the top has someone who's in New Zealand, all alone, right? They're taking it. But if you look at the photo on the bottom, it's the exact same location, but people are queued up in the middle of nowhere in New Zealand to take the exact same photo. And I think that this photo, these two photos together, really show me about what's happening in New York City around social media, things like Instagram, where people are trying to recreate different locations. And we need to really try to distribute people to different areas outside of just one area. I have another example from New Zealand that they're using a campaign to try to get people to different places, but I think that photo is kind of cool. So next, I want to talk about microtourism. So microtourism is an idea of going somewhere within 30 minutes to an hour away from where you are to really check out the local community. And if you kind of span that out a little more, people with public transportation or cars, if you went 3 to 4 hours around the sort of Boston, New York City, Washington, DC, megapolis area, you have 50 million residents to travel. And I think there's a real opportunity to create people to rediscover New York City on the local level. During COVID, people are trying to find more outdoor areas, but I think that the recovery with vaccinations being a little bit slower in different countries, we have an opportunity to really bolster microtourism. And New York City can be a leader within microtourism. The actual concept of microtourism came from a Columbia business alum who's based in Japan. He was getting different people to leave from Tokyo to go to kind of rural areas outside of Tokyo, only about an hour away. He took those double-decker buses that we see in Times Square, and he brought those into the rural areas and gave kind of nature rides through different mountainous areas in Japan, and also create culinary specialities of the local rural areas outside of Tokyo. And they were able to really bolster the tourism. So New York City, obviously people go to the main locations in maybe Brooklyn or Manhattan. There are so many places. There's City Island out in the Bronx. There's so many places in Queens, Brooklyn. I know many of you are in those locations. We could really have people rediscover New York. I know we've done that before from a marketing standpoint, but how can we really bolster that tourism? And that really can come from the mayor to really create those zones. I know they've talked about art corps, where we have different artists doing different public work projects, but I think we can do the same thing for tourism. So another thing which is obviously impacting New York City and renters and everyone living in New York is the proliferation of Airbnb. And Airbnb, including VRBO and all the other different tech companies, there's been a precipitous increase in rents across the entire city because of Airbnb, and trying to look at different historic or popular areas to prevent Airbnb or different listings with them to raise rents, trying to minimize that and maybe relocate them to other areas where they can be distributing. The historic districts in New York, which obviously have some older housing units, are very similar to what we see in Europe. And Europe has the exact same problem with Airbnb. The rents have continued to increase, and they're trying to address these problems, but they want to prevent Airbnb from creating different listings in these sort of smaller historic districts, because they actually eliminate the housing for the local community. So I think that's one thing that the mayor does definitely need to address, how that plan, because it really hasn't been addressed. And New York City can be a leader for that. And it's one of the major markets for rentals in the entire world. So kind of coming back to really what my takeaways were, I want to go into the social media part. If you talk about that photo we saw a little bit earlier around a New Zealand campaign, it was called the Social Squad. So the Social Squad had somebody who said, don't go to the same place, try to find a new unique place. There's actually a place I'm in Upper Manhattan right now. And there was this staircase in the Bronx, which was in the Joker film with Joaquin Phoenix. And there were actually so many people that came to this random staircase in the Bronx. People in the Bronx started to complain that tourists were coming all the way to this one location and just taking their photo, just like the Joker did in the film. And I think this New Zealand campaign initiative took a comedian to kind of make fun of the social media influencers, to say, hey, try to find a new spot. Don't keep on finding the unique spot. And I think that within the American kind of influencer context, it is an important element which we're not acknowledging, how the algorithm of people trying to repeat similar kind of photos or images need to be redressed, and trying to find a social media campaign, which could be something around the I Love New York, maybe I Love Unique New York. I know Catherine Garcia has a campaign or a policy for Rediscover New York. I think Sean Donovan also talked about different sort of tourism or arts and culture options. And that's going to be really key for us to have a campaign where we kind of have people reimagine New York. I did talk about Airbnb, sort of long-term costs of having the historic areas. There could definitely be a different approach in regards to popular neighborhoods, talking about maybe the East Village or Lower Manhattan, different places in northern Brooklyn. There are also benefits if we have people start going to other neighborhoods. Obviously, there are different unintended consequences that we all know from economics. We don't want to be pushing people into different areas, but the main idea of my memo is to really redistribute people to be going to different areas around New York. And I think within COVID, people have been staying to their kind of local neighborhood, and these things have been happening where people are kind of creating their new centers. But I think within tourism, we can actually build those things out. And that actually starts with when people are being welcomed into New York. When people come into New York, there actually is not one agency within New York City that is the Office of Tourism. there's many different agencies. So my idea in the memo is to create a interagency office of tourism, where you can have a tourism czar who's going to look over and try to create a welcoming environment for the people coming in, but also to educate the people that are based in New York. It could be in the schools, it could be in other ways, for people to be really understanding the tourism, but really trying to increase people, not necessarily just international tourism or different domestic tourism, but really even just the micro tourism that I was already talking about. People can rediscover. I know there's a lot of New Yorkers who are very proud they've never been to the Empire State Building or the Statue of Liberty, but there's other opportunities on that side. Finally, with the climate impact, really looking at different sustainable ways to build sort of a carbon tax or something in regards. That's not something obviously New York City can do itself, but it can still advocate for more lessening different flights or different ways in which people are doing things. Because the ultra low cost flights are really what is driving some of the different tourism in different areas. So I talked about creating the Office of Tourism and implementing historic neighborhoods within Airbnb, and also talking about the Rediscover Unique New York campaign, and then really focusing on microtourism with the 50 million travelers in the Northeast corridor, and then a carbon tax for priorities. I didn't get to look at the chat here, but I wanted to really open it up for questions for anyone who has them. If maybe there's someone who's already put in there, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to put my contact information in here, and then I'll also add my memo and presentation so everyone can check it out if you'd like. So put that in there. Does anyone have any questions?
I'll start us off. So you've learned a lot through your career, and in your research since you've been with us in the EMPA program. What kind of person would be a great tourism czar? What kind of background would, if one of the mayoral candidates somehow got a recording of what we're doing today, or just came to the website and looked at it and said, you know, that's a great idea, and called you up and said, okay, I like that idea, I'm gonna promote it. What kind of person should I be looking for to be my tourism czar?
I would want all the mayoral candidates to be successful, but I think people like Catherine Garcia or Sean Donovan, who have shown success, I think, on the local level, but also on the federal level, either people of similar ilk to them would be good people to understand. I think really trying to unite the different interagencies. I mean, there's different areas, Professor Emick, in New York City, if you look maybe in Brooklyn Heights or Dumbo, where we can really improve the streets and the overall dynamic in the area. And it's not really being done on a city level, it's being done by private businesses. And I think public-private partnerships, I think the different public-private partnerships that we've learned in the program, that they've really been successful to do, but I think that the city can really drive things even more. I know that there's different philanthropies, but I think there's an approach where the city can kind of go all in. Another thing that the czar could also put in is a kind of dashboard or metrics of the numbers of tourists that are coming into New York, to really be able to understand the larger metrics and to allocate resources across the board. We have so many people coming inbound through the Port Authority or through the airports to really understand how those flows go. I think that it's not really being done in a holistic way. It's being done in a very ad hoc manner by many different agencies. So someone like, again, like a Catherine Garcia type of candidate would be able to, oversee that kind of czar area. Obviously, she could become a mayor as well. But that would be my answer, Professor Emick.
Thank you. Just one other quick question. Well, someone else has their hand up. Greta has her hand up, so Greta should go. I'll come back later.
Oh, thanks, Professor. Paul, just a really quick question for you. A couple of the examples you used were from film industry. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on sort of also diversifying where things are filmed, creating new destination areas through the film industry. If you had any thoughts on that end, or if other places like New Zealand, for instance, have made some progress on that front.
Thank you, Greta, for that question. That's a great question. I think that they're definitely the filming locations, if you're talking about TV or film, in New York, they definitely focus on certain neighborhoods. I've actually noticed that they've gone to less popular neighborhoods because they might be cheaper. Even in my Upper Manhattan neighborhood, they frequently film in Upper Manhattan because it's cheaper than filming in Brooklyn. So I think that from an economic standpoint, people are moving to different areas, but I think that we're giving away free parking to these film industry people. There's a lot of giveaways that are done to the different industries, and I think finding different ways to incentivize maybe film or TV or different places to go to underserved communities to maybe highlight a new neighborhood or a new place in the Heights is coming out, I believe, in 2 weeks. And I think, and I live in the Upper Manhattan, and I think that that could possibly be creating people to be coming here, similar to within Williamsburg and Greenpoint, with some different TV shows, trying to highlight the different parts of New York City, but trying to incentivize the groups to go maybe to different areas would be helpful. Thank you, Greta. I did see Sanjay has a question here. Has NYC legalized Airbnb? I think that there's definitely been some things in the city council and also across New York City in general, but there's kind of a gray area. Primarily, it's legal if you're a single person to rent out your room or rent one place, but they're trying to not allow someone, let's say a landlord, to rent out an entire building where they have 12 apartment buildings. So those types of things are not legal, but the problem was Airbnb wasn't being transparent with their listings, and they're trying, I think the city's been working with them to try to be more transparent to stop these super users, because what happened, and this happened in 2008 actually, there were different condos that were going to be going on sale, and they just converted them over to Airbnb just so that they could start renting out the rooms, and those were places where people could actually live. And this continues to happen in New York City. I'm not sure if I answered your question, Sanjay.
No, you did. I wasn't I know there was a big fight between Hotel Union Association, Union, and Airbnb. And Airbnb was ready to give a lot of incentives for NYC, but I've been out of touch since last few years. So I don't know if things have changed, but it seems like there are certain conditions under which you could do it.
Yes, there are certain conditions, particularly if you're an individual, but there's a lot of different groups which have stopped people from really, like a co-op or different buildings, which are not allowing you to really do Airbnb as much. I see some people are writing some comments in here. I've lived in my residential Queens neighborhood for 16 years, and my film been going on all time, because the period look takes away from a lot of the street parking. So that's from another sort of filming question. But I think for the Airbnb question, if you really look to Europe, Sanjay, I think they've actually have a worse situation than New York City is happening. Places like Venice, throughout Italy, Croatia, they have even smaller housing stock, and New York City has benefited because it has some housing stock. But I think that, to me, Europe is kind of the canary in the coal mine, where you see that these issues are going to be happening. This could affect New York City too. We're not realizing how much Airbnb has affected our rents. And obviously things have come down a little bit during the pandemic, but if there's a tourism boom again, I think the rents are going to be going really higher up in the sort of main areas. So how can the mayor with different policies or different ways kind of work with Airbnb and different purveyors like that to prevent the areas. Obviously, the hotel industry has always been a very strong union industry where they've advocated for their side of the hospitality side. We do need to have more housing. I think where I formerly worked, a youth hostel. The youth hostel actually was one of the rare places where people could live in affordable places. But now people do not really want to be at a youth hostel because of COVID and because of safety concerns. So I think the same thing where people are going to be going back to hotel rooms and then going back on Airbnb or renting an entire apartment. So I think that there's definitely going to be a post boom. Another thing that I did notice in my research where there was a lot of people with the remote working, they're going from one city each month or every 3 months, they're going to different places and they're just renting out an Airbnb. That seems like an issue. And then also not New York City particularly, but places like the Hamptons or different scenic locations, they've seen an sort of influx of people living in those areas, and that's taking up too many resources. So it's not really something that affects New York City, but I think the people that have gone to the Hamptons and, you know, everyone's has using all the resources there, that sort of tourism economy affects probably more scenic locations. And I wonder what will happen when people are coming back.
Oh, thank you.
No problem.
I mean,
does any-
Paul, this is a really important and complex issue, right? Because we really don't have a hard number on how many apartments. I know from my perspective from the FDNY, this is a huge safety concern because there's a fire, they go into a building, they expect, you know, X number of people, and they find, for example, like you illustrated, a building where there's nobody who really lives there, right? So, you know, there should be like 2 people in an apartment, there are 11. There are numbers of apartments where there's nobody. You know, so there's a safety concern and then the pricing concern and the legal concern. In New York City, it is really illegal to rent out your apartment unless you're there. So, and it's illegal to rent out an apartment for less than 30 days. That's the law. But the law is obviously not enforced. It's impossible to enforce unless somebody files a lawsuit. So we really need to sort this out. And it affects tourism, it affects neighborhood impact, it affects affordable housing. So it's a complicated issue, but one that needs to be addressed because it's growing.
You know, what's happening right now, what was the biggest switch, what I've noticed right now, which is all the long-term stays, a lot of buildings have converted into long-term stays. A lot of hotels, like about 20 to 25% of hotels have gone out of business. Some of them will never open, especially large ones like Hilton, Hyatt, and all.
Yeah,
Will never open. And places like Waldorf Astoria, which had already planned to reduce it down to 100 rooms or 200 rooms, which was pretty much in line with converting into residential and then taking all the rooms, which what Plaza did, right? That was their boom. 98 rooms and the rest becomes like multi-million-dollar. Now, so for anybody traveling to New York, the situation is going to get worse as the time comes because there is not that much development coming in and a lot more have closed. And we were always tied to begin with. Yes, to get to that $700, $800, $900 room night may take some time, but the big hotels, which always commanded that, are still commanding it in this time.
right.
So you know, like a Mark or Carlisle or Mandarin Oriental, they already have those rates, so they really don't care. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens. New York City hit the peak mark in 2006 or 7, I think, in their average rate. Since then, it kept on declining, and then it really jumped again in 17 and 18. So,
well, again, this gets to part of Paul's argument. You could start to redistribute hotels, right? You could build hotels in the Bronx, more hotels in Queens, and And again, with your marketing and education of people, right now, I think many people who come from overseas think I have to be in Manhattan because otherwise I'm not going to be where all the action is. When in fact, it might be optimal for them to be in places in Queens and in the Bronx and have a less of an impact on housing and much more of an impact on the community. And if you make it easy for people to go from one place to another, like by mass transit, for example, right? Even through the pandemic, I still take the subway all the time, and it's a lot faster than calling an Uber, and it's a lot cheaper too. So, yeah, but it requires, I think, a new mayor who really thinks through this whole question in a more systematic way.
Paul, while we're talking about this, do you think the new office space, which is especially in Midtown, which is coming available, and the word was that it might convert into residential because those guys can't really maintain their expenses, can't even pay the basic expenses to run those buildings. Do you see the like demand being met through that way, like getting some of the offices into the mix?
I think the real question, Sanjay, is about the zoning in New York City because things are so strict around buildings. Obviously, commercial buildings are actually built sometimes much better than actual residential buildings. So it would be a good opportunity. But I think that if the city doesn't create those kind of situations and move quickly to retrofit or change those things over, the marketplace of places like the tech companies with Airbnb will swoop in and will maximize those things. Also, there are people that do stay in Jersey, Jersey City, different places, and they take the path or are different ways to go in the city. There's also on that side. But one other point I want to bring up is the business travel. We're talking about tourism in general, but business travel really with COVID is not going to be recovering in the same way. It'll be taking 3 or 4 or 5 years before business travel is recovering to the same level. And that really was where travel and tourism really made their profit. People the airlines made a lot of profit off of those people that were booking very last minute. The people that are getting their cheaper flights early on, the budget travelers, don't make the profits, but the business travelers. So it will be very interesting to sort of understand how the airlines and the hotels and the different sort of Airbnb type companies are going to change the things because they need to work on that. I can see hotels in different neighborhoods and boroughs, plus free transit around the Northeast Corridor. I think that's a good idea, and I can see someone put a link in there. Yeah, I think just upgrading the larger transit infrastructure. If you go to places in Asia or you go to places in Europe, you can see the transportation infrastructure is much better. New York City is a sort of shining light with a pretty good public transport system. And really, if you go in other parts, Boston or DC, you don't have such a good public transport area to really get to all the different locations. So it's really a challenge, but at the same time, that's what the mayor can do, can look at the sort of holistic problem. And that's where I was really trying to frame it. And I'm sharing this memo with the different mayoral candidates. We'll see if anyone does respond. I know Andrew Yang is a law alumni, so we'll see. But again, I think some other people on that side. So, but again, there's a lot of opportunities. We have 27 days away from the primary election. So it's really for all those registered Democrats, I just recommend you to all get out there and get the vote, because your vote really does count a lot with this primary election. And this was really, again, a privilege to speak to all of you on this topic. And again, with Professor Emick, I think I was someone on this call, Paul Ross, who's on the call calling in from Paris. We were talking about this for over a year now. So it's really exciting to be able to share all the different research results that I came through and information.
Paul, it was a great presentation. I think, we are at, as you said, we're at a unique time in history. The COVID subsiding, a mayoral election, changing the way we live and work. It may not be, all these people, some of these people will go back to work, right? Telecommuting will be reduced, but it probably won't be eliminated. So that Midtown office space, a lot of that is going to be freed up. And zoning, it's in the city's power to use its power to sort out how we reuse that. And maybe there are ways to create affordable housing, and maybe there's ways to create, new spaces in new neighborhoods. So it's a very exciting time. And I really think over the next 10 years, we're going to see, I think, a lot of creative thinking, and hopefully your great thinking on tourism will be part of how we reshape our future. So thank you so much. And thanks everybody. I'll turn it over to Jeremy. He's our convener and our summer upper, whatever you call the person who closes the event.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks, Paul, for the wonderful presentation. I think that question about free public transit was mine, a little self-interested. But I hope that, as Bill said, these recommendations get picked up for this new administration. Hopefully there are some big changes and we take COVID in stride and grow as a city. And I wanted to thank everyone else for their questions. And I hope we can see you in the next Food for Thoughts sessions. So thank you everyone for joining, and hope to see you soon.